The refugee crisis in Europe is a pressing concern for the EU, its allies, and the world as a whole. The greatest concern that arises for security in the EUCOM AO is refugee radicalization. The Syrian crisis alone produced 4 million refugees and displaced nearly 8 million more. Using the DSRP method of systems engineering, we can apply this to help us analyze the issue at hand and come up with a few courses of action to reduce refugee radicalization. The D in DSRP stands for distinction. With that being said, for this analysis, we are focusing on Europe and EUCOM in specific. We are also talking about the bordering countries of Syria. The S in DSRP stands for systems. Our system at hand is Europe, EUCOM, the home nations of the refugee, and the bordering countries of the refugee's home country. The R in DSRP stands for relationships. For this problem, we are looking at the relationship between the EU, the refugee, and the refugee's countries bordering that country. The P stands for perspective. We are looking at this problem through the perspective of the EUCOM commander and the EU Council and its citizens. In order to produce the most useful course of actions, we had to talk to many stakeholders to find out what the real problem is and to evaluate priorities in fixing the issue. Currently, through discussion with the EUCOM, EU Commission, NATO, the UN, and heads of state in Europe, we have identified the problem of refugee radicalization within the EU borders. We have been tasked with coming up with a few courses of action that can reduce the likelihood of refugee radicalization taking place within Major General Elvin's AO and EUCOM. It is important to note that each stakeholder has needs and wants, and some may be conflicting in nature. For example, the needs and wants of a specific state, and therefore the head of the state, may be different from the EU as a whole. However, these differences are accounted for in the overall prioritization and valuing of each requirement and value measure.
Through research conducted by RAND Corporation and discussion with our stakeholders, we have concluded that our effective needs statement is: the countries in Major General Alvin's AO need to provide basic essentials for standards of living, reduce barriers for entering the EU, and obtain support from host nations in order to reduce refugee radicalization. Moving forward with a fundamental objective derived from our effective needs statement, we identified 3 necessary functions with their own respective objectives. First is to allow refugees to enter the EU in a more efficient manner. This will be accomplished by maximizing the number of refugees allowed in while minimizing the asylum application process. Second, to support refugees' needs within the country. This would be accomplished by maximizing caloric intake for each refugee, maximizing shelter and medical conditions, as well as maximizing educational opportunities. Lastly, to transport refugees securely and efficiently. This will be done by minimizing time spent for refugees in screening and minimizing the length of the repatriation process.
Using the stakeholders' value measures, we created a swing weight matrix, which takes into account 2 variables: variation impact of the value measures on the decision, and 2, the level of importance of the value measure to the decision maker and the stakeholders.
Using the value models and stakeholders, we created key decisions that would be necessary in a candidate solution. The Zwicky's morphological box was created with options that span the design space. These then informed the 5 candidate solutions that we eventually created. A feasibility matrix was used to assess whether or not our candidate solutions were in fact feasible. EUCOM only has 700 million euros allocated for the refugees. Additionally, the EU as a whole only has a finite amount of resources to maintain security and to provide for the refugees. As a result, these are limiting factors. Candidate solutions that do not meet these factors would have to be eliminated. Moreover, the more refugees we allow in, the less buy-in socially there will be in the EU. Due to our feasibility matrix, we had to eliminate our first and second candidate solutions because they did not meet these necessary requirements, and as a result are infeasible.
In our first course of action, keep them out, we can help a number of refugees within our value model within the EU borders, but we can also help even more if we focus help outwards and secure safe zones in the refugees' native or bordering countries. Keeping them out allows us to help more of them, would be highly favorable in social support, it is much cheaper to sustain, screening process would be faster, and we have enough resources to facilitate refugee camps there. Keeping them out with our 700 million euro budget from the EU would cost roughly 2,300 euro per refugee in a bordering country such as Jordan, where that would provide food, water, education, and opportunity. The poverty line is significantly lower in bordering countries compared to the EU, which would make housing and education much less costly.
Our second course of action is the blended model. In this model, we will bring a limited number of refugees into Europe. This will get greater support from the EU members, as fewer refugees will be coming in. It will also put less strain on the European economies because they won't have to deal with large influxes of refugees. There will still be food, shelter, and other basic essentials provided to all refugees. Additionally, education will be provided to all refugees. Since we're only bringing a limited number of refugees into Europe, we'll still have a significant amount of funding that can then be used to help refugees still in their native countries or in bordering countries. This will allow for a greater impact on the refugees, even if they don't come into Europe. However, this course of action costs significantly more as compared to keeping them all out of Europe because of the fact that we're bringing them in, and that incurs costs because transportation and the cost of living in Europe is much higher.
The third course of action is Tent City. The Tent City course of action proposes the complete allocation of resources and effort into sheltering and admitting a given number of refugees. As the name suggests, this solution will place all the refugees in tent cities within the European borders. As with the previous courses of action, food, shelter, and education will be afforded to the refugees. Additionally, this provides complete separation of the refugee from the conflicted region they came from. This comes at the cost of public approval and a tighter budget. Resources and transportation into Europe are very costly and put a heavy burden on individuals as well as nations themselves. Keep Them Out, Blended Model, and Tent City are all feasible solutions which have their own unique benefits and consequences. No matter which candidate solution will be chosen, the end result stays the same, that refugee radicalization in Europe will be reduced. For too long, Europe has been the victim of these attacks, and it is now up to the United States Army European Command to take charge and find a solution to this complex and international problem.